Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you here. Thanks for taking an hour out of your afternoon to join us in discussing this topic that I'm very passionate about and very excited to talk about today. So like Linda said, I became passionate about this topic while teaching at a university, a Christian university, and just seeing a lot of young people who were excited to go into ministry and had come there feeling called by the Lord. They would study for several years, and then they went into ministry context, and often they became disillusioned and discouraged, and I want to really understand why that was happening. So that's kind of what propelled me on this journey. And so I'm going to discuss some of my findings and really kind of get into the nitty-gritty of what we can do to engage young people into ministry. But first I'm going to talk a little bit about the cultural context in which we're living right now that kind of influences how millennials think and approach the church and ministry. That's in some ways a little different from older generations. So I'm also just going to invite you, if you have questions throughout the presentation, please go ahead and just type them in the chat box, and I'll just kind of be watching the chat box as I'm talking. I love to engage and incorporate answers to questions and comments as we go if possible. And then like Linda said, we'll have a designated Q&A time at the end so we can leave some till the end as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and just jump into this. So as Linda already kind of presented me, I just also want to note that a lot of what I'm talking about today is content in my book. Especially towards the end, I'll be focusing on the last part of the book about really getting into the nitty-gritty of what millennials are looking for. And it is available at judsonpress.com. So when we talk about millennials, one of the first questions is, who are you talking about? Who are millennials today? So here kind of is a breakdown of the generations that are in the workplace and coming into the workplace in the next few years. So we have the silent, or sometimes it's called the builder or civic generation, and these are really the individuals who are primarily donors now. They often sit on boards. Sometimes they're still in the workforce, but more often than not, they're on boards or as donors. Then we have boomers, who are really the 50 to 69-year-olds, and those are the people who are running most organizations and churches today. And they've worked very hard to get into the positions that they're in, and they expect people to, kind of go along with the plan in many ways because they've worked really hard to get to a place where they can implement the plan. And then we have Generation X. I'm an Xer, and roughly Xers are 35 to 49. And I like to say we kind of got the bum deal because we kind of got squished between the boomers and the millennials, who are two really large generations. But Xers can be really great at helping teams navigate the differences between older generations and younger generations because they do often understand both very well. And then we have the millennials, the topic of the day. They were born roughly between 1980 and 1995. So roughly they're age 20 to 34 or 35 right now. Now, sometimes people can break millennials down to two groups. So sometimes there's older millennials who do resemble Xers a little bit more, and younger millennials sometimes represent Generation Z a little bit more. So again, I like to reiterate that these are generalizations, they're categories, so they're not necessarily applicable to every person in that age range. Sometimes you'll meet a millennial who really thinks like a boomer, or you'll meet an Xer who really thinks like a teenager. But they give us some categories to kind of understand general mindsets. And then we have Generation Z and Generation Alpha, who are our teenagers and our children, and definitely are following some of the similar trends that millennials have set. So that gives us a little bit of a context of who we're looking at. So let's go ahead and just look at a few statistics regarding millennials that help us kind of get a framework for what's going on with these young people, both in the church and in the workplace. So 91% of millennials say that they will expect to stay in their current job for not more than 3 years. So one of the complaints that we often get from pastors or leaders when they're recruiting young people into their ministries or churches is the fact that young adults don't always want to commit for a long time. And if we're going to invest and pour into a young person, we would like to know that they're going to be with us for the long term. But this is not a trend that's just affecting churches. It's affecting businesses, corporations, and there's multiple factors for why millennials do commit to a very short time. One is that they just feel like there's a lot of opportunities out there. You know, back in the day, if you wanted to do something, you typically just would go to the local. If you wanted to be a pastor, you would maybe study and work at your local church and not think of moving, unless there another opportunity arose. But nowadays, there are online job boards posted everywhere with opportunities for young people. And so there's so many opportunities that sometimes they feel like locking themselves into just one can eliminate the possibility of doing other things that God might want them to do. Starting in 2015, so last year, baby boomers are no longer the majority of the workforce. It is now the millennials. So millennials are now the largest percentage of the workforce, and for churches or organizations that are struggling to engage them, this is important to remember, because if we don't engage them effectively, our organization, our church, our ministry really has a shelf life of about 10 to 15 years until boomers begin to retire. A few other facts. 1 out of 3 young professionals under the age of 30 prioritizes social media freedom over salary when choosing to accept a job. And I like to just highlight this statistic because often when we're looking at how to motivate young people, we tend to use the same tools that we used with previous generations. But if you have 2 positions and one of them you're offering a young person $50,000 and another one you're offering them $45,000, if they keep their phones turned off and don't check social media, 1 out of 3 is going to accept the job for $45,000 over the job with $50,000 where they cannot have access to social media. So they're a very interconnected generation. They want to be touching base with family and friends throughout the day. They want to be engaging in their community via social media. And so that kind of speaks to the fact that they're motivated by some different things than older generations were maybe motivated by. Another interesting statistic is just that there's 4.8 million job openings in the United States right now, the highest level since January of 2001. However, half of the employers can't find qualified workers. The gap between higher education and the workforce training has been identified as a critical problem for the U.S. So sometimes when we're looking at young people who are coming into our ministry context as volunteers or as staff, we can be a little frustrated by maybe a lack of critical thinking skills or a lack of decision-making skills or problem-solving abilities, and we can kind of view them as maybe being immature. But in reality, what we're seeing is across the board, this generation has different sets of skills than older generations in some categories. And so there's a need to really develop some of those skills that might be lacking. And again, it's not just in the church, but this is in the workforce in general. This illustration just kind of shows the dynamics that we're facing right now. Boomers are a very large generation. And then Xers are not so large. Okay, so we have over 70 million boomers, only 54 million Xers. And again, millennials, some statistics show them to be over 80 million with immigration numbers. So we have a huge kind of bubble of boomer leadership that's going to start to kind of pop as boomers are retiring. So as we're looking at our ministry context, it's important to think about what is our succession planning. And if we are not actively engaging and equipping millennials to be leaders, we're going to have a leadership shortfall because there are not enough Xers to replace those leaders when the time comes for boomers to retire and to move on. Okay. Again, I just want to invite you, if you have any questions at all, you can go ahead and post those in the chat box, and I will kind of respond to them as I go if I'm able to incorporate those into the discussion. Okay. So one of the common questions I get when I talk about this is, aren't all young adults just the same? What's the big deal? Why do we make such a fuss about millennials? Won't they just outgrow some of these trends and mature? Yes, some of those things they will. outgrow and mature in. So there are some things that are called life cycle effects. And these are things that young people tend to share at a certain point in their life. So for example, you have young people who are graduating from college, they have a degree, the world is their oyster, they tend to be very idealistic, feel invincible, that they can conquer, they can change. Okay, after 30 years of having life beat you over the head, people tend to get a little bit more realistic. So that's a life cycle effect where young people tend to be more idealistic, older people tend to be more realistic, and that will change as people get older. Life cycle effects are the pieces of a person that do change. Period and cohort effects are really the pieces that set each generation apart. So when we talk about period effects, we're thinking about an event that happens at a specific place in a person's life. So for example, 2008, we had a recession. That recession affected people very differently if they were 65 and on the point of retirement and lost a large percentage of the retirement savings versus a recent college graduate who maybe had $50,000 in student loans and was looking for a job in a job market that was really struggling. So how an event affects you and then forms you for the rest of your life is called period effect. So for example, with millennials, that recession, graduating, coming of age, graduating from college or seminary around the time of the recession, and seeing a lot of people who had invested a lot into organizations, ministries, corporations for years and years of their lives, losing their jobs, losing their pensions, losing their houses, going into foreclosure. It really impacted them in that they are not prioritizing long-term commitment to organizations because they understand, they saw that organizations can drop them when it becomes inconvenient. They also are not investing as quickly into things like a house or retirement savings because they don't have the same confidence that prior generations had that those things are going to be good investments. So that's a period effect. We then have cohort effects. Period events and trends that influence young adults as they're developing their core values. So this one, I believe, is really the most critical one when it comes to explaining why millennials are so unique. One of the things that has been influential, of course, is technology and how they communicate. Their ability to be connected to people all over the world all the time, to have a 24/7 lifestyle has impacted them. Of course, globalization has impacted them. And then we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about the self-esteem movement as well as postmodernism, but how these things have informed them as they're developing their core values informs them in a way that creates a worldview that sometimes can be radically different from prior generations. Now, I believe that millennials are really a transitional generation because of that cohort effect piece. We see that prior to millennials' birth, America kind of functioned on certain underlying foundational values and ways of thinking. But at the time of millennials' birth, there was a transition going on that really affected how we're looking at the world. And millennials were kind of the first generation to be born in this new way of thinking, which was fostered by postmodernism. So if you're not a history buff, just bear with me for a minute. I'm just going to talk really quickly about this because it's really significant. Historians and cultural experts explain to us that every couple hundred years, a society and a culture undergoes a major upheaval where ways of thinking get reordered. So when you track back in Western civilization, you can see a couple of these periods, but these apply to various civilizations across the world over different periods of history. You can trace back major upheavals, okay? But just for the sake of simplicity, if you go back a couple hundred years in Western civilization, we had something called the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, and out of that came the Industrial Revolution, which were all really significant. And they happened primarily in the 17 and 1800s, so a couple hundred years ago. If you go back a couple hundred years before that, you had the European Renaissance with the Protestant Reformation. And so there was a lot of transition, obviously, as we came out of the medieval era and transition kind of into the modern age. Now, the modern age, so the Renaissance along with the Enlightenment, really have informed a lot of American culture since its inception as a nation in the late 1700s. The Industrial Revolution, the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason were all kind of propelling, part of the propelling of the American Revolution, and then the growing industry in America and economic boom. So our nation really has not known any other values or modes of thinking other than those that were based in the Enlightenment and the modern era until postmodernism came along, okay? The ideas of postmodernism have been around for about 100 years, but they really first took hold in popular culture in America in the 60s and 70s, okay? So boomers and a lot of the cultural upheaval that occurred in that period of time ushered the ideas of postmodernism into popular culture in America. So when millennials came along in 1980, I like to say they are the first postmodern natives, the first group of individuals, the first generational cohort who thinks like postmodern individuals. It's because even though boomers ushered a lot of these ideas into popular culture, they still have been raised and educated under modern ideas. So what do I mean when I say modernism versus postmodernism? Here's just a few of the ways that these ideas are really affecting America and as a result, the church. And it's important because as we're talking about ministry vision and where the church is going, this piece really becomes a sticking point and an area of conflict on many ministry teams because most churches are built on modern thinking and modern processes and modern hierarchies. And yet young adults who are coming in with more postmodern ideas are often finding that modern structure very unfulfilling and frustrating. So there's some really basic things like communication driven by the printing press versus communication being driven by the internet, right? Objectivity in facts, so basing decisions on things that we can prove per se versus subjectivity and kind of really basing decisions on stories and personal experience and even emotion. And we can see this even in court cases nowadays, right, where we're telling a lot of stories versus making a rational, logical argument for a case. Distance and hierarchy, okay, and this really speaks to people being in places of power or position, and we give them honor or credit or respect because they're in these places of positions of in the hierarchy, right, of power. Young adults don't care about that so much, okay? They're about participation and engagement. So just coming to church and listening to someone in a pulpit talk to them, a clergy member share with them, yet having no participation in what's happening in the church or any relationships with that person can make it very difficult for them to engage sometimes. This participation engagement piece also comes from the fact that, well, for one, they've been raised in a collaborative education system, okay, where they get points for working together as a team, not always necessarily for the result that they produce. So they become much more focused on participation and engaging with other people than necessarily wanting a specific outcome. It also comes from the fact that with technology, they've been participating in discussions for many, many years, okay, since they were in elementary school. They can get online, they can post comments, they can respond to people's ideas, and they don't have to wait to have permission. Okay, I'm getting a comment here that there's some questions, but I'm not seeing the questions in my chat box. Okay, just I'll come back and check on that in 1 second. Okay, so really we need to make sure that we're finding ways to engage young people as they're in the conversation. Okay, then we have kind of the mechanical structure, and this comes out of the Industrial Revolution model where we are making sure that things are as efficient as possible. We have a very clear structure. Everybody has their roles, and you participate within your role. You do your part. Versus a more organic and open, things are fluid and ever-changing, okay? Efficiency over adaptability. Determinacy, that if we do certain things, we're going to get a certain outcome, versus indeterminacy, I might buy a house, but it could go into foreclosure tomorrow, okay? I don't know what the outcome's going to be. creating things, and that was part of that industrial revolution. You know, we're going to create and build, versus deconstruction. What postmodernism really looks at is, okay, we maybe have produced fertilizers and machinery and all these things, but we haven't solved world hunger. And on top of that, we've created some other problems that maybe we did not anticipate, like the side effects of some of these seeds or fertilizers. Okay, so just as an example, we created a lot of good things, but then postmodernism's coming along and saying, I don't really know if these solutions are creating more problems or solving the initial problems, okay? Individualism, okay, that local context versus feeling like they're a part of a community, part of a global context. And here are really the two big ones for the church. Power and faith in human reasoning versus power and faith in personal experience. And then confidence and reason to discover truth versus the acceptance of self-determined pluralistic views. That everyone can have their own perspective and it is valid and they're all equal. And that piece of it is really good, just understanding that people, we need to show respect and understanding to all people. But sometimes what gets lost in there a little bit is the fact that if we're respecting and understanding everyone, it can become very difficult for young adults to know what they really believe. They're having a personal conviction because they're so busy having to kind of absorb all these different perspectives that are all equal and valid. So a lot of times young adults are accused of not having the right passion or conviction, but it can be very difficult for them to develop that. Okay, just a second. I'm going to look here. I don't think I have the right tab open for questions. Let's see if I can find it. I apologize. Just give me a minute here. Okay. Linda, where is the questions tab? I'm not seeing it on my screen.
Okay, in the control box,
Yep.
the question should be near the polls drop down. So under under attendees, do you see a questions?
Let's see. I don't have that.
Okay, go to the top of your control box and click on view.
Okay.
And then click on the questions. You may not have it highlighted in your control.
Okay. I have attendees, audience view, chat, webcam, video. I don't have a questions tab up here. Let's see. I don't see one anywhere.
Okay. So.
Okay, hold on. Let me just say. No, I don't. I have a save questions log, but I don't have anything that.
Okay. So do you want me to share with you the question?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Please share strategies for engaging the millennials in your ministry using social media, especially technology, and also share training and coping strategies.
Okay. I'm going to get to some of the specific strategies at the end. Okay. Are there any questions more specific to what I've talked about so far?
I'm checking.
Okay. And again, I apologize. I'm not seeing the questions here anywhere.
No.
Okay. Okay, that's a great question. So let me get to that in a little bit when I get more into the specifics of millennials and how they think, okay? So millennials, who are they? Okay. So I want to give this big cultural context because this is who we're engaging. So millennials are really the first generation of postmodern natives. So they think very differently. When they approach the world, they're coming at it with a different expectation. So often the structure and the predictability of the modern era and how we've kind of functioned as a church does not resonate with them. Like I said, they're born 1980, 1995. They've been raised in the self-esteem movement where we've told them, you are special, you are special. Yes, you are from the time they were born, okay? So sometimes millennials can be a little bit entitled in the way they come across, but that's because we've told them they're special. They've been very protected by helicopter parents in many cases, who, if you do something wrong to their child, whether it's a teacher or a coach, they're threatening you with a lawsuit, that type of environment. So they've often done a lot of things for their children, so their children maybe don't have some of the skills that previous generations had. They're very connected with technology, they've grown up under postmodern mindsets, and they've been educated in this idea of tolerance and teamwork as the highest values. So those can trump a lot of other things, whether it's, authority or position or whatnot. They're very much tuned into being accepting and working together. Okay, they can come across often, like I said, as entitled and special, and again, that's because of the way we raise them, the parenting trends. They didn't raise themselves. They're very sheltered and protected. So they, nowadays we don't let kids just go out in the woods and run for hours like we used to. And in doing that, when they would go out in the woods or down the street with a group of friends or over to a friend's house with a group, and they were just kind of unsupervised by adults, sometimes bad things happened. But in those situations, they also learned a lot about problem solving, about making decisions, about deciding who was the leader. Whereas nowadays, we've raised kids mostly in sheltered environments where they have a video camera on them, security camera watching them when they go into school, when they leave. They have a GPS on them or a cell phone. So they're used to someone being able to come to their rescue if something goes wrong. They can be very, and what that has done is it's kind of created a false sense of consequences. So an example I like to use is that if a kid falls off their bike, they should get a skin knee. Okay, but nowadays kids have knee pads. So they fall off their bike, they don't get a skin knee. So sometimes they don't have a true sense of consequences because there's always adults or protections there to kind of help them navigate through things. Pressured in achieving. There's a lot of pressure on doing versus being. And, speaking to the social media question a little bit, one of the things we're finding is that young adults don't always have a sense of identity, who they are as a person, because they're so consumed with the profiles, the presentation that they're putting out on social media and in different arenas. Some of that gets fueled as well because we're having more and more children who are growing up and in different kinds of homes, where parents are not living together. And so in one home they have to behave one way, in another home they have to behave another way, or they're in school and they're in various sports programs, and so different coaches, different teachers expect different behaviors. So students kind of learn to be adaptable to the environment that they're in versus really understanding who they are as a person, which can be a little bit problematic then when they're young leaders in our ministry context. They're collaborative team players, like I said, connected and informed, and they're committed to life versus work. Okay. Linda, just go ahead and jump in if there's any questions that come up as I'm kind of going along here. Okay, I just want to highlight a few places where the generations do differ, just kind of in how they approach things. Attitude with authority is a big one. So whereas the silent generation kind of had the perspective we're going to just endure the authority, whether we agree with them or not, we're just going to endure and kind of get through. Boomers really sought to replace authority and worked really hard to many of them to be in positions of authority and power with some influence now. Xers kind of just ignore them. And millennials really choose who they're going to follow. So whereas older generations sometimes just gave respect based on the position, young adults are really deciding, even if you're their boss or their leader, they're going to choose to respect and follow you based on whether or not they feel like you care about them, you're invested in them as a person, you care about the mission that everyone's committed to. So they're really going to choose their leaders. Role of relationships. So millennials have 24/7 global relationships. One of the weaknesses of that is that they're never disconnected, and again that contributes to the fact that they don't always have a good sense of who they are. They don't have a lot of solitude or silence in their life because they're always connecting via social media, texting, and whatnot to those relationships in their life. role of career, and this is where ministries, this is one of the strengths that ministries can really offer to young adults, because whereas the silent generation coming out of World War II was really looking for a means of living, boomers really looked at a career as a central focus and how to change the world. Xers kind of looked at it as an irritant, a necessary evil to pay the bills. And millennials really want their jobs to have meaning. Often when we're hiring millennials, we're kind of giving them the scraps of the jobs that are left sometimes, the jobs that other people don't want to do, or the jobs that are hard or not appreciated, because they tend to be coming into entry-level positions. But we need to make sure that we're equipping them and giving them jobs that really give them meaning and a sense of purpose, and that even if they understand the greater organization is giving them a sense of purpose, that what they do connects to that. Okay, so there was a comment about how millennials are considered the me generation, and that really does go back to that point I made earlier about them being special and entitled and really focusing on themselves. And part of that has really emerged from the fact that as parents and leaders and teachers, we've made the focus them. So even when you think about, I was an education major and I taught in the school system for a while, and we moved from a teacher-centered approach to learning to a student-centered approach in learning, where the specific learning needs of a student, the specific whatever it might be, the way that they interact with material with other people, we introduced a lot of programs to help individual students, which was really, really great. But what it did in the process was kind of teach students that whatever I need, that's what's going to be given to me. And the same with the helicopter parenting, that if I need something, my parent's going to fight for me to get that. And it didn't teach students really to say, I need to learn how to adapt to the environment. So even if this teacher is not teaching the way I learn, I need to kind of adapt and figure out how to manage. We really catered a lot to the students, and that made them really a me-focused generation. Both the parenting, the education system, and then as well, along with that, social media, that's all about them, right? People liking what they say, retweeting what they say, commenting on what they say or they do. So there's multiple factors that have gone into that me generation dynamic. That's a great question. Schedules, this is a big one, and this is one of the things that people get a lot kind of frustrated with when they're trying to plan young adult activities or programs, is the fact that young adults don't always commit to things. So you might invest, several months planning this big young adults or youth event, and then nobody shows up or very few people show up. How do you get people there? People aren't committing. One of the things is that young adults and youth have very volatile schedules, and a lot of it is due to these little devices that they carry around, because they might be on their way to an event at church, but a friend texts them that they just had a flat tire and they need a ride. Okay? Now remember, they prioritize their life, relationships, things that they know are not going to be taken away by a recession or a terrorist attack. I say that, but that's not necessarily how they would articulate it, but because they live in such a volatile and unstable world, they prioritize the people and things that matter to them. So if a friend needs them, that's going to take precedent over a church activity. The other thing, it goes back to that just plethora of options that they have. So because they know that there are so many things going on all the time, and that they can hear about them via, a text message or a post on social media at the last minute, they don't like to commit to a particular thing because it excludes the opportunity to do all these other things. So I often tell people that your best chance of having a good show up at an event is to just text everybody, an hour before the event. And then they might ditch whatever else they're doing to come to the event. But their lives are just so changing and so volatile. Versus, Xers who had a little bit more aimless schedule, because a lot of them were latchkey kids, a lot of them grew up in single-parent homes, and so they kind of had to figure out how to take care of themselves and didn't have an adult necessarily directing their schedule. Boomers have been very busy, have more frantic schedules. Silent just grew up in a more mellow era. Okay, those are the main things I think. Okay, Great question about millennial relationship role, global 24/7, how do you define relationship? Okay, that's a great question. This is one of the other things, that whole focus on doing versus being creates a little bit of a different definition of relationship sometimes for younger generations. They don't always understand the same depth of relationship that older generations would use in defining relationships. So if I call someone a really good friend, it might be different than someone who's 16 or 18 or 22 calling someone a really good friend. You know, I have a 23-year-old brother, and he just was commenting recently to me that he's like, none of my friends just sit down and talk. Like, he's like, I just want to sit down and have a real conversation for like 2 or 3 hours and talk about things that really matter. But he's like, they cannot even disconnect from their devices long enough to do that. So he's like, I'm longing for that, but they don't know how to do that. So yeah, so sometimes we call friends people who are acquaintances, people that we maybe worked with, people that we've just friended on Facebook or connected with on Instagram or whatnot. So you're right, that can be a little different. Here's what millennials really often need, though, is to someone to really engage with them in that deep, thoughtful relationship and teach them and mentor them and what that can really look like, because for some of them, no one has ever taught them. They've had parents who are very busy, who are running from thing to thing, you know, and nowadays even we hand kids a laptop or a tablet in the car versus actually having conversations. So in many cases, no one has taught young people how to have real relationship. And so they use the term relationship, what we would say, somewhat lightly. That's a great question. Okay. So when it comes to work ethic, so this is a little bit more millennial specifically in your ministry context when you're working on a ministry team. You know, the traditional work ethic is work comes first. Like I said with millennials, life comes first. Traditional work ethic says that I'm going to follow the rules no matter what. And millennials, because they grew up in that postmodern mindset that really values deconstructing and asking why are things the way they are and do they really work well, they follow the rules that work when they understand why they're there and why they work. So what we need to really be doing is evaluating, why do we have the rules or the policies or the procedures that we do have for our employees and our staff and our volunteers, which ones are working and which ones are not. And often when young people are asking that question, why, we view it as disrespect, when in reality it is a true, genuine desire to understand why something is the way that it is. Okay, another question. We do church meetings according to a boomer mentality but need to involve millennials, of which I, the pastor, am one, in leadership roles. Absolutely. So that is a great point, because again, it goes back to that need to participate and to be engaged, to really have buy-in, and to feel like you're connected to something that is meaningful. So when young people have a leadership role and they have some influence and they can feel like they're connected to something that's meaningful and they're engaged in participating, it can really help with their retention. So that's a great point. Thank you for bringing that up. Let's see. Okay, and then this individual continues, but boomer ways of doing meetings are exasperating to me and I'm paid to be there. How might we change meetings leadership structure to involve millennials more effectively? Great, great questions. Okay, one thing is there has to be some level of discussion, and going back to this point that I'm making right now about following the rules that work and for them to understand why they work. So often in meetings what we have is we have an agenda that goes from point to point to point to point, and so one person standing up talking. It's a downloading way of conveying information. Okay, so it's the way that we often have learned or shared information over the years in the modern age, where we had professors who gave us lectures, we had teachers who gave us lessons, we had pastors who gave us sermons, and we would go in to a training and expect the expert to download information to us. But finding ways to actually encourage question asking, encourage participation, even encouraging some discussion, small group discussion and feedback in the midst of meetings, young adults are used to being engaged and giving feedback every step of the way. When we move to student-centered team education, they learned in groups processing information verbally. So in meetings, if we can find ways to take some questions, take the information that we're sharing and turn them into some questions that people can discuss or ask for some feedback, even if we can't do it verbally, maybe like some written feedback. And then, of course, letting people's voices be heard in some way. People can learn through verbally processing. The other thing is sometimes we're just sharing a lot of information and we're not doing a good job of anticipating the questions and incorporating the answers to those questions in the information we're sharing. So not just we spent this much money on missions this year, but why we spent that on it, and then incorporating some of the stories and some of the personal experiences that go along with that. Because again, remember, younger adults under that postmodern mindset, they value that story, that emotion, that experience, not just the facts. So sometimes in our meetings we're reporting a lot of the facts versus making it kind of relational. And so those are a couple of ideas. And again, that's a great question. And having some different people involved in the presentation of the meeting too. Get people engaged. We often, well, I'm jumping ahead of myself, so I'm going to tackle a few more points related to this here in a minute. Okay, the boss deserves respect versus respect must be earned. Seniority equals promotion versus talent equals promotion. So if I can do the job better than you, why should I not be promoted? 9 to 5 work hours, okay? So really work being based on hours versus millennials are much more about no defined work clock and work being based on the completion of their task. So they want to have more flexibility. If they're in a back office working on projects, do they need to be there from 9 to 5? Could they be there from 10 to 6? Or because relationships are so important to them, often they want to be out of the church office and engaging in relationships. So making sure that we're working through some of the workplace expectations and figuring out what's a good balance for getting work done and having the office covered, but also giving people flexibility so that they can, take care of family and friends, but also engage in relationships in their ministry context. Dress the part at all times versus dress the part as necessary. Why do I need to be dressed, professionally if I'm sitting in a back office and not talking to anyone all day? Or if I'm at a cafeteria talking to high school students. Those types of things, okay? So making sure that we're having good conversation about that and talking about, where can we compromise and what are the points that we can't compromise and why can we not compromise on those? Okay, traditionals will change to meet the needs of the organization. Millennials are very much, they're going to expect the organization to change to meet their needs. And a lot of that comes out of these perspectives on ministry. So this is the whole second half of the book, really hones in on this little diagram right here. There are shifting priorities and values in ministry contexts that reflect that shift from modernism to postmodernism and boomer-driven leadership to now millennial-driven leadership. So we've often allowed our churches, our ministries to function as businesses because that is really kind of how our culture works. Okay, we have strategic planning, we have vision casting, we have budgets. Sometimes in some types of churches you even have executive pastors, right, or associate pastors or clergy. That even terminology sounds more business-like. Versus young adults are coming in and they want church to be a family. So going back to the point about the meetings, we often run church meetings as business meetings versus a family gathering. Okay, so at my house we used to have family meetings growing up, but in those meetings you could tell stories, you could laugh, there was fellowship and interaction versus an agenda. So now the agenda is necessary in many cases, but how can we bring more of the family feel into some of our church business meetings? Okay, leaders as bosses versus leaders as parents and friends. So young people really want their pastor and their leaders to make that same investment into their lives and into the relationships that parents and friends do. They've grown up, again, with parents and teachers who have prioritized their needs. And so if they walk into a ministry context where they have a pastor or a leader who is not prioritizing them but is prioritizing a program or the budget or something else, that in itself is a disconnect on a couple of levels. First, just in regards to how they grew up, but also in regards to their values. Presentation and formality versus intimacy and informality. So often we focus a lot on our Sunday morning services or the presentation of a specific event. We want to make sure that everything's perfect versus really focusing on, are people having genuine interactions? Is this a place where people feel safe and comfortable and where they don't have to be perfect, but they can feel engaged? And that ties into the prioritization of programs over people. So young adults do not care so much about programs as they do about people. They want to make sure that people are being served and engaged. Another big one, and here's another thing about programs. If we have a program that we're trying to keep alive and we're having to twist people's arms and coerce people to run it or to be there as volunteers, we need to ask, is it a program that we still need, that we still should have? Because millennials are not going to be about promoting a program or staffing a program or funding a program that's not effectively servicing people's needs at where they're at. Okay, success being measured as number of bodies or members versus success being measured as spiritual and personal growth. Success also being measured in the buildings that we have, the budgets that we have versus community, relationships, service, and outreach. So much more intangible. The millennial values tend to be much more intangible and harder to measure, much more qualitative versus quantitative. And then when we're looking at young adults who are in ministry, you know, often pastors and leaders in ministry contexts have put the ministry first. They put the job first, maybe over their personal needs. And millennials are not willing to do that. A lot of them have watched ministry leaders burn out or become discouraged or disillusioned, and so they are prioritizing family and friends sometimes over the ministry. So that can be another point of contention. But it's not all bad, you know. Millennials want to be healthy. They want to be able to serve God in a healthy manner for a long time, and they've seen a lot of leaders who have burnt out, and they're trying to avoid that. So, great. So what do millennials want? They want to feel valued, appreciated, special, to have authentic relationships, to receive constant feedback and affirmation. They want to be part of something meaningful and to feel like they're making a meaningful contribution, to have flexibility and freedom, and to have opportunities for professional growth and promotion. So those are some of the things that they're looking for when they come to us. The other thing is a lot of these values are also kind of what they're looking for in social media. So when we're looking to engage in social media, they want things to be authentic. They want to feel special and appreciated. They want to be engaged in a way that it's not just a mass a mass post to the group, but that people are hearing what they're saying and responding to the questions that they have. So one of the best things you can do to really propel a successful social media campaign with millennials is to sit down and talk to millennials, to find out what questions they're asking, what their concerns are, what their needs are, and then really incorporate some of that into your social media communication. They need trusted mentors and coaches. They need affirmation of the talents and contributions that they're making. They need constructive feedback, and they need it constantly. So annual performance reviews are not going to do it. They need a leader who's engaging regularly and giving them input, giving them affirmation as well as constructive feedback. They need sincere explanation for the why behind processes and systems that seem confusing, and they need to not be shut down when they ask the question why. They need role models of effective professional and ministry practices, advocates of their needs and perspectives to leaders, and the patient equipping and empowerment, sometimes in very basic skills. Like I said, sometimes those problem-solving or decision-making skills, they need a trusted mentor, someone to come along and kind of help them as they learn how to do that more effectively, because it's not something that was naturally taught to them in the way the education system's functioning now. Effective intergenerational leaders. They possess emotional intelligence, they ask good questions, and they listen. They understand the differences and perspectives and values of the different generational cohorts. And they help educate different groups on those differences and the potential. Millennials are so creative, they're so enthusiastic, they have amazing technological skills. There's so much that they have to offer our team. So really doing the education of what we all bring. Creating systems that empower every group and maximizing the strengths of intergenerational teams. Okay, so again, I just wanted to remind you that the book is available on judsonpress.com. This is my website and my email, so if you have any specific questions, you can contact me directly, but we have a few minutes now for any specific questions. Okay, so how would the role of a pastoral relations committee help a millennial pastor do evaluation and help transparency in evaluation with a congregation when the values are so different? I'm not sure what you mean exactly by a pastoral relations committee, but here I'll just throw out a few ideas. One of the things that is just most valuable for a young leader or millennial is to just have someone who's sitting down and having really honest and authentic conversations with them. So if you have a okay, I think I got it. So a millennial pastor do evaluation and help transparent evaluation of the congregation. Okay, I think I understand the question. So, I mean, some of it's going to be having just really honest conversations and doing some education on these differences. So, like one of the things in the book is that there are questions at the end of each chapter that can help foster the conversation around some of these topics. So if you have a pastoral relations committee, maybe even just pulling out some of those questions and helping that foster some conversation around the issues that are, or the concerns that you have in your specific context. Because every congregation is so different. But I think for a millennial pastor, because you're often working with, you know, lay leaders who are a little bit older, to just have some resources to say, here's how I think, and here's some conversation questions that maybe then can help you guys hear from each other and hear how you're approaching these topics, and then bring some understanding as you propose some ideas. So yeah, that's a little bit of a, that's a tricky conversation. It's hard if you are the millennial pastor and you have a lot of older leaders that are working with you on some of those things. But I would really start with the conversation, because that understanding has to be there before you can really propose anything. Well, I'm waiting to see if there's any other questions. I'll also just respond really quickly to that question earlier about social media and how to engage them. So much social media is effective and can be really effective, but I would really encourage you that in your churches, focus first and foremost on the face-to-face relationships, because young adults can get so much on social media from so many places, and what they're longing for is deep, meaningful, family-like relationships. And that's one thing that the church can offer that they're not getting in their culture, and often from their friends. And so if we can start with really offering authentic relationships and not worry about the numbers at our young adults events or at our youth events as much as how many deep relationships do we have with young people in our church, that can be a great place to start, because social media in of itself is not as effective if we don't have those relationships with young people to begin. So yes, I would say that. Any other questions? We just have like a minute or two here left. So I kind of flew through a lot of information. Again, the book covers a lot of this in more depth, as well as I have a blog on my website that I talk about a lot of these topics on a regular basis. I also have a newsletter that I send out regularly that you can sign up for on my website. So feel free to do that, and I talk about this regularly, or you can email me with any other questions. Okay, one last question. How do you reach the young adult that's been churched but not connected to Christ? How do you reach the young adult that's been churched, that's been churched but not connected to Christ? Again, with young adults, it's always going to go back to starting with relationships. And it's a huge investment, because they have to know that you're authentic, they have to know that you care, and they have to know that you love them, regardless of if they are connected to Christ or not, or if they choose to follow Christ or not. I'm actually mentoring a young girl right now who's in this exact category. She's actually a pastor's daughter, but I would, she is not connected with Christ. She doesn't even know exactly what she believes about God. And, I've been mentoring her for almost a year, and we've talked about God only on a couple of occasions. But there's certain topics that she's watching my life, she's watching my testimony, and there's certain questions when she needs an answer, she knows she can talk to me about them. So it's been a year of laying groundwork and building trust and that authenticity so that we can start to have some of these conversations. She can see what being connected to Christ looks like in my life as we do life together. And then I'm a safe place where she can ask hard questions that she might feel ashamed to ask about in church. So a lot of it is really laying the relational groundwork, modeling it, what it means to be connected to Christ in your life, and then just creating a safe relationship where they can ask questions when they're ready and when they're hungry, and doing a lot of prayer that the Holy Spirit would just really draw them to Him, to Christ and to His truth. So yeah, there's not an easy solution to this. It's hard work and it's time consuming. So, okay, I know that we're out of time, so I want to respect your time. But like Linda said, this will be made available to everyone. She'll send it to you. And again, feel free to email me with any specific questions. I'd love to respond to you.
Thank you, Jolene. This has really been a rich and full presentation, and I am hoping that everyone got something from it. I encourage you all, again, to learn more about millennials by picking up Jolene's book, Millennials in Ministry, available on judsonpress.com. And I also invite you all to join us for our next Emerging Leader webinar called Reclaimed Faith in an Emerging Generation. And you can learn more about it and register on our website by going to the news and notes section. I will also include that information in the follow-up email that you get later on today. So again, thank you all for attending and have a great day.